Why don't we go ahead and jump right in? And one housekeeping note, we will be recording this for anybody who can only join us for a portion of the time. You'll get the recording and a copy of the slide deck and email with the email address that you registered with. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to first introduce Crystal, who I'm really excited to be speaking with today. Crystal is an executive consultant at PTP, where she helps leading brands reimagine how they engage with customers and employees. By blending modern strategy with next generation technology, Crystal guides organizations in designing and implementing AI solutions that elevate interactions and deliver real business impact. And ASAPP has the pleasure of partnering with PTP, which is a CX consulting and implementation partner, to help forward-thinking brands deploy, select, and implement AI solutions that elevate every customer interaction and drive bottom-line results. And I can speak from personal experience that working with this team really brings a breadth of understanding of the CX space and a really novel orientation towards new technology. So, Crystal, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you for that kind introduction and those awesome words. It's really my pleasure to be here to introduce you, Mackenzie Smith, to our audience. Mackenzie heads up customer growth at ASAPP, leading a team of customer engineers, success managers, and insights to build impactful generative agents to the world's biggest brands. So these brands rely on ASAPP to help them modernize the way they interact with and serve their customers. And she works at ASAPP, an awesome AI native solutions firm that solves the hardest problems in customer service, helping leading enterprises scale capacity, reduce costs, and turn contact centers into true value drivers. And you guys had some super exciting news this week, the launch of your new customer experience platform.
We're very excited about it. And it was a really fun process to watch like the vision come into reality. Yeah, we announced that yesterday. And the CXP, we think of it as something that really redefines AI's role in the contact center and allows organizations to build to what we call the agentic enterprise of tomorrow. But
Love it.
There's a lot in there, and maybe we'll get into some of those concepts today. One thing that Crystal and I have talked a lot about, and we're excited to talk about with this group today, is why AI adoption is not really a challenge anymore. That's a need and a demand of the industry that we all work in. But it is quite challenging to figure out how to choose the right pilot and roll this technology out effectively. So if we move on to the agenda for today, we're going to be talking about why pilots succeed or fail, how to align innovation to risk tolerance, and how to select high impact and low risk use cases so that you can thoughtfully roll these kinds of capabilities out into your own organizations. Before we get into, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I love this agenda because we're speaking to people who maybe have not ever piloted or maybe have done many pilots and are live in production. So there's something for everybody today in our conversation.
Totally. And maybe before we jump into the hows and the whats, we can ground ourselves in some studies that have been done. There's one that got a lot of press earlier this year from MIT that posited that 95% of generative AI pilots at companies were failing. And I should say this is the Fortune headline of the MIT study. And once you dig into the mechanics of the study, you start to see there's a lot in there, which we'll dissect a little bit. But specifically, the study highlights a gap that really, when you think about piloting these kinds of capabilities, there's a gap in the measurable impact to the bottom line or to the P&L for enterprise organizations. And like I said, there was a lot of buzz around the study. We're still talking about it a few months later. And I think that's because it hit on some critical concerns that many people have. It's about how can I bring this new adaptive and paradigm shifting technology into my existing business? And how can I do so successfully? How do I know how to balance the ideas of experimentation with keeping the lights on and running my business as usual? And how do I know that it's working? And these are common questions when you think about general technology adoption in the industry, but they need to be reframed or rethought through with something that's as flexible and changeable as generative AI capabilities are. So, like I said, it's a big subject. And as a result, Crystal and I are talking today, but this is really part one of our conversation. We're going to be doing a part two of the same discussion with another member of the PTP organization on December 11th, where we'll not just talk about how to choose pilots, but we will talk about how to start proving results. And Chance, who's a member of that team, will be joining us to unpack real-world testing methodologies, frameworks, and success metrics that separate the effective pilots from failed experiments. All to say, Crystal, thank you for being here for part one of this great conversation. And I think we both agree this is meaty enough that it might require two separate discussions.
Absolutely. And that headline is a terrifying headline, but I think from our perspective, it's not as scary as it sounds. And we're going to talk about some strategies today to overcome that, so you're not part of that terrible headline. And learning about piloting and all the mechanics that go into it and how to be successful is a learned skill. It's knowledge, it's skills, and we have that knowledge and we have that experience to share today. I'm excited to keep going.
Yeah. And maybe to that point, let's ground ourselves in terms of where the audience that we have today, where they're coming from. So I'm going to ask a question, but we'll give you a definition first. So using the definition of a generative AI agent being a system that can create new content based on learned patterns from training data. They can generate human-like responses to novel situations, can handle complex, nuanced customer inquiries, and introduce variability and creativity in their responses. So with that definition, and I see, so thank you to some of you who've already answered the question, have your organizations launched a generative AI agent pilot? And it looks like we've got a few answers so far, but helpful to know where people are coming from. I think one thing Crystal and I talk a lot about is these aren't finite processes. These are constant cycles of learning and adopting new technology. So lots to be learned regardless of where you are. All right, great. Thank you to the audience for grounding us. It looks like we've got about a third of the audience has launched a generative AI pilot. 2/3 have not. So hopefully we'll provide you with some practical tips for how to get started. And when it comes to this study, we've talked a little bit about some of the whys and the wherefores, but I think there's really two key points that we found were worth diving into, and we'll be talking a little bit about today. One is there's misaligned expectations. And when you don't have a clear understanding of the potential performance of the technology, as in what ROI is it going to deliver, how am I going to measure ROI, you end up with a series of unsatisfied stakeholders. And then there's gaps in the technology itself, whether it's not effectively integrated into common workflows, isn't designed architecturally to be scalable beyond a pilot stage, or lacks capabilities like feedback loops. You can really get into a situation where you need to be able to figure out how to bridge your reality in a pilot stage into production, and that's very challenging. So
it strikes me, Mackenzie, sorry to interrupt you, but it strikes me when we see misalignment for resource allocation. If you've not done pilots and you don't have this capability embedded in your organization, how might you even know what the resources you need are? Yeah. So it's not that big of a surprise that those things create failure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to that point about misaligned expectations, there's the resource allocation. The study has an interesting point that it's both the resource allocation to execute and then to scale beyond pilot. And that's what you're getting at is it's one thing to do this thing in a laboratory, but another into production.
Yeah.
And then another hallmark of the failure is that they are often designed to avoid friction, meaning back to that laboratory point, they are built in such a way to allow for quick prototyping or proofs of concept. But when you're trying to apply these technologies to real world problems and deliver real measurable results, you've got to get in there with the gnarly details. You've got to unpack the business logic that's been there for 10 years and talk to the one subject matter expert who really knows the policies inside and out to start to abstract away some of that information to power these systems. And so if you're thinking about a pilot as something that just avoids friction altogether, you're probably going to end up with something that's less than valuable and in that dreaded 95% that you were talking about.
Yeah, not ones to promote flying under the radar with these types of pilots. We really need to expose what we're doing, have great planning efforts, work across the organization so that we're getting the right resources, the right access, understanding things that may not be known to everyone. But to your point, that SME that's got all the keys to the kingdom for a data table or something like that. So it's
Yeah,
not a skunk work secret kind of thing to lead to success in general.
absolutely. And that's a very nice segue actually into what we see that works. In the 5%, the study found, and we can cite this from our own experience at ASAP in partnering with you guys, that successful organizations manage to iterate quickly. So they have a concept, they know how to work through the capabilities and bring it into production. They very quickly define the outcomes that they're looking for. And by outcomes, you can you think of terminology like ROI and payback on the investment, but you might also think of outcomes that are about customer delight or improving the customer or agent experience. So just having a sort of clear-eyed understanding of what success looks like and what outcomes you want to drive with the technology, super critical to being successful. And then back to that point of tying it to measurable value, technology for technology's sake is a really interesting intellectual exercise, but we all know that's not where the buck stops. And so being able to tie the concept of a pilot to both the value you can deliver in the immediate term and painting a picture and having an understanding of the longer term, I think is especially important and admittedly tricky in a field where the technology 6 months ago looks very different than the technology today. And that's why this theme of iteration, defining your outcomes, and then really measuring things matters. Before I move on, Crystal, any thoughts on those successful organizations and what you've seen?
I totally agree with you. And I think planning and getting started is sometimes the hardest part, because when you think about how to define success, you know what you want to do. You want to cut costs or you want to create better experiences. There's a finite amount of metrics to go after. And how do I select what the pilot might be able to deliver for me to prove what those metrics are and what kind of resources I need to prove that? And so all of that big planning, we see sometimes our clients skip too much of that step.
Mm.
And really, that is just something that we see as a factor for success. Initial planning, thinking through the strategy for the pilot, and then comes the good part of execution.
Absolutely. And measurement. But no,
And measurement.
to hone in on what you just described, if we think about what successful organizations look like, we can also think about the success factors and how to positively influence, put your thumb on the scale that an organization is going to have success. And I think the themes that came out of the study, but also that we know from our experience working together and with customers, is that, like you said, use case selection is incredibly critical, both for your pilot and where you want to go with the technology or the capability. Having execution and measurement discipline is very important. We work with some mutual customers who have extreme discipline around how they measure the efficacy of these products and how they measure the changes that are made so that they can really start to understand how the technology is working. And I think having that rigor and curiosity about how the technology works is a really important marriage for these kinds of pilots because, like I said, you're not just dealing with, I want to test and validate my hypothesis. You're trying to experiment with, is this the right technology for my organization? And that means having a kind of open-ended or open mind to the way that different technologies work and what their application is. And then I think something that I know you're particularly passionate about, Crystal, that is really important to success in these pilots is being clear on the innovation tolerance that you have in your organization. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I would love to. And then we'll get back to use cases. How's that sound?
Sounds great.
Okay, so when we think about innovation tolerance, we have a concept to help people in that planning and execution phase understand where they are, where their team is, and where their organization is on the tolerance scale. We talk about this a lot. Change is the constant, and it's only getting faster, and the cycles are only getting shorter. And our world, we've said this for many years, is just so dynamic and becoming more tech-driven. And that's never been more true than it is today. And so when we think about that, means we have to be adaptable. We have to want change, or we have to create change with ourselves and with our organizations. And Mackenzie, I know you are a fan of change. I know you work in an organization that does a great job at change, just had some changes this week.
It's
Same
true.
for me.
Yep.
Same for me at PTP, but all organizations aren't like that. Some are slower, some are different, and some people are less adept to change.
Mm.
So we came up with the notion of understanding from an innovation perspective, how tolerant is your organization? So what we have here is the innovation tolerance model.
Mm.
And it really helps us understand what your organization, what your team's capacity is for change. It helps us understand whether you, your team, your org can accept, adapt to, and effectively manage the uncertainty, disruption, and change that comes with innovation.
Mm.
And just by its nature, innovation pushes boundaries
Mm.
and creates that change. So this helps us see how willing and able people are to embrace new ideas, processes, technologies, and even business models, even when those things challenge business norms and create risk for the organization. So that's what this model's about. There's a lot of words on this page. As Mackenzie said earlier, we're going to send this out. So don't worry about screenshots. Don't worry about trying to read it, zooming in, any of that. We're going to send this out. And this is a conversation we would love to continue to have. But at the highest level, the factors on the y-axis really help us signal what the innovation tolerance is. So
Mm.
the attributes of culture, AI role, org design, etc., those are the components that make up the tolerance. And
Mm.
then across the horizontal axis is really the stage. So of course, like any model, you move low to high, and we have 4 components here that help you measure. A couple things about this model to know. This is customized for AI. So we spent some time together working on how we focus this model specifically on AI deployments. Another thing just to please note, none of this is a judgment. None of this is good or bad. It's really just a tool to help you understand where are we and how do we need to structure work appropriately, and how might we do work to move over to the next level. And finally, you might be in different places for attributes. So it's not necessarily linear. You might be really high on culture, but on budget, you might be low. So you don't have to think of it as I go across this row. You might be in different places across the board. And we wanted to deep dive into a couple of these areas today, ones that Mackenzie and I think are really important when it comes to piloting before we get into use case. So how does that sound?
Sounds great.
Okay, good. Thank you. Deep diving into culture. This is an argument that is ripe for happy hour. Is culture the most important thing? It's a coffee talk, it's a wine talk, it's whatever talk you want to make it. But Mackenzie and I agreed on, yes, cheers, agreed on culture being arguably the most important thing in this model to consider. So let us tell you a little bit about what culture is made up of. It's made up of leadership modeling signals of what's acceptable. So leadership, of course, it starts with leadership. Leaders who visibly back pilots and tolerate failure and normalize innovation score very high for us on this model as part of culture. Culture also includes incentives and rewards. So those are the things that drive behaviors. So we want to see performance metrics that reward all aspects of a pilot, including failure, because we're learning from that. So it's not about low risk taking, it's about planning for that risk, isolating that risk, taking that risk and learning from it.
Mm.
Of course, we want cross-functional collaboration. We've got to break those silos down. Always a big challenge. We look for, as part of culture, psychological safety. How do the employees feel about being part of this innovation, about being in these pilots? Are they safe? Are they worried? Do they fear for their job or fear for how they may be viewed? Or do they take that innovation, and does leadership learn from that pilot and let it fuel improvement even when there's failure? So that's the culture row and what we think about, what makes up corporate culture when it comes to innovation tolerance and AI deployment.
I'm super interested in that last point you were making too, even as it relates to the MIT study and the headline. Like you can imagine a reframe of this whole problem, which is not 95% of all pilots fail. It could be 95% of these pilots prove their hypothesis is incorrect. And then they go on
Yeah,
to test the next thing. And the
yeah,
point being that like we are talking in this discussion about the importance of piloting technology. And embedded in that is this assumption that they will not always be successful if the only way you measure success is it was ROI positive. You just have to have
right.
clarity on what it is you're attempting to test and understand that you can have a successful outcome even if you've proven your hypothesis was incorrect in the course of the pilot.
Exactly. Exactly. And I mentioned that this model is made for AI specifically. And so there's that AI role as a second really important attribute in innovation. And my favorite thing about Mackenzie working with you and your team at ASAP and working on innovation and thinking about these kinds of things is that paradoxically, AI can increase your innovation tolerance. So you can use AI to
Hmm.
move yourself along in this model and get better and better
Sure.
and make the experimentation faster and safer. And there's a couple specifics around that I think are key to point out, and that is how AI powers rapid prototyping. So we're able to have AI help us spin up POCs, proofs of concepts, pretty quickly, and also help us lower the cost of failure because we have another brain in there helping us out. It is imperative to help us reveal data-driven insights. So predictive analytics and using AI to help show where the risks may be more worth it than other places is another application there. Simulation and testing, using AI models to help us look at what ifs as we're designing our pilots and experiments. And then finally, the continuous learning and how AI uses its own, is trained and tuned and learned and helps us do even better. So that's a pretty cool paradox that we find in this model that creates a nice feedback loop for us as we're helping our customers move across to the higher performing components of this model.
Makes total sense. Yeah.
That's good. So just last thing, and I think folks are really interested in hearing about how to pick a use case. I just want to say that AI is really, it's not just a technology that we want to tolerate. We believe, on behalf of our two companies, believe wholeheartedly in the power of AI and how it's transforming our interactions every day. It's both the reason that organizations need stronger innovation tolerance, as well as a tool to help it build. So companies that are doing this really well are those that pair AI adoption with cultural readiness. So creating that psychological safety, getting the leadership buy-in and the leadership as really waving the flag on it, using AI to lower the cost of risk and make experimentation a routine in your organization. And finally, balancing the human empathy and oversight with machine speed and scale. And I know that's something that we really talk about a lot in our organizations and with our clients together. And I think it's interesting for me to think about what others believe. Let's just take culture, for example. I wonder on the call if we popped a poll up, if you only think about culture, you don't have to think about all those other pieces. But if you in your organization think about culture, where are you on the scale? So low, moderate, high, or very high. There's a poll popped. Let's see what our participants think, Mackenzie. And
I feel like this is a great question to ask on a Thursday going into the holiday season as people are trying to figure out both what, like how they're ending their year, but also what they're planning for next. As people are answering it, Crystal, I think you bring up a really good point, which is this is a sort of a self-evaluation that any individual can do as they're trying to lead these things forward. But it is about not just evaluating your own self and how you do a change, but how does your organization handle it? You have to plan effectively for what the organization can accept. Looks like we've got
That
some.
was a hard lesson I had to learn along my career at some point, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Looks like we have a pretty emergent group. So we're
Yeah,
heading
good.
up the scale.
Thinking about your organization, where you are, should impact how you select a use case for your pilot.
Hmm.
And I know Mackenzie has some great information to share with us about use case selection.
Yeah, this is something that as part of our customer engineering practice, I love to think about. And it's both about the conceptual side of things. Where do you want this technology to fit in your organization? What do you expect of it? And also very pragmatic sort of execution style decisions that need to get made. So it's a fun blend of concept and reality. We find that every organization has a really good sense of conversations or transactions that ideally would be handled by generative technology. And so the exercise we often go through is helping them to whittle down that larger set of conversations, like where is my order or dispute a transaction, and figure out where to start. But then once they've selected the use case, to then plan across a couple of dimensions. And if you've got, let's say, 4 or 5 good contenders for what your use case is, you can use these as ways to whittle down your options to something that you really want to get started with. So one question we really like to ask is, what's the business value that you would be proving through this use case? Does it solve a real pain point, or are you just choosing it because it's the fastest one to get started and you know the guy that manages the API and you're going to get it off the ground quickly? Does it actually align with where your organization is going? Is it going to help you 6, 9, 12 months from now? Or is it something that just feeds an immediate need? So keeping the what does it serve and who is it for idea in mind is really important. And then we think about technology fit. And this is something that comes up at ASAPP a lot when we're engaging with customers and prospective customers. Our technology, we believe, is very good at a lot of things. It's not well suited for certain applications. And being able to have that dialogue with the technology partner you're working with or with the consultancy you're working with about what's the right fit of this technology
Yeah.
versus the use case, I think is an important level of transparency and
Yeah.
thoughtfulness early on to save you and your organization a bunch of time. And it's not just about what integrations are required or can I do this here, but is the technology really good at the thing that I want it to do? And in that channel and in that forum. So that's another dimension we think about. Crystal, I know this next one is near and dear to your heart, which is the operating model. Like thinking not just about, as you were saying at the start, do I have the organization to pilot it, but do I also have the organization to run this thing in production and planning with an optimistic eye towards the future, saying, okay, I'm going to choose my use case, but how's this thing going to run when we're at full steam is important to start at that use case selection stage. And then we love to have this conversation with customers and prospective customers early, but it's who gets to decide if this thing is a success, because that is often a difficult topic for many organizations. You want to chime in?
Yes, we see that coming from many different levels of the organization on sometimes even prescribing the technology or prescribing the use case. But if you can run a solid pilot and get good data, that will reveal all.
Yeah, exactly. And then as Crystal was describing for us, innovation tolerance and the cultural considerations are super critical for when you're selecting a use case. And I bring these 4 elements up because when we talk about use case selection, it can often get to an intent level or like a diagnosis of a certain type of conversation. And those are very important because, like I said, you have to have the practical details. There's no point in choosing a use case for a generative application that you can't give it access to the right information. You're not going to have any ROI. But
Right.
sort of second and third level thinking about where you want to go with the use case, we really try to encourage early on in the conversation. So you know the pilot is actually setting you up for success in the long run. So how about this? When we think about what we've talked about so far today, and we think about the innovation tolerance and the challenges and maybe use case selection, Crystal, maybe we could try and just pick a use case and talk
Okay.
about how we might design a pilot around it. Oh, and before we jump into that, I will make a plug. If anybody feels like they're having trouble getting started with use case selection, we have an ebook ready with 100 generative AI agent use cases for the contact center available with that QR code that we would be happy to get you started with. But yeah, let's try and talk about how we might balance innovation
Okay,
tolerance and smart pilot design.
let's do it and let's put this into action. So I think that a key takeaway that we want everybody on this call to hear is that no matter where your organization is on innovation tolerance, you can still pilot and learn. And the experience of piloting and learning is precisely what moves you up and moves you along that scale. So please don't think you can't pilot if you see yourself on the lower end. You've got to start somewhere, and that's as good a place to start as any. And so what you do in that case is design the pilot to match what your organization can handle and what your team can handle. So that's a critical point when we talk about planning. So thinking about a use case, let's go with maybe just a very simple generic billing inquiry as a starting point.
I like it.
That can be really broad or really narrow. And so what on the screen here helps guide us when we look at our pilot playbook and we set up the pilot and run the pilot. We've got 6 steps. And when we overlay the innovation tolerance stages to those, that changes how you work. That changes how things are structured. So when we take the why, defining the why for a billing inquiry, and if you're low on that foundation, you want to start with a single narrow objective. Maybe it's, I just want to reduce the time it takes to resolve that inquiry, and one metric. And maybe that is literally time. Or maybe you want to say accuracy of that billing inquiry. How many times do we get this right? So something very specific, and then create those guardrails around that very small specific thing. On the flip side, if you're way up in transformational, you have got to have clear business outcomes and metrics. You have got to know what success measures are going to be impacted here. What are those metrics? How are they tied to CX? How are they tied to effectiveness? How are they tied to efficiency? How are they tied to trust? When you're talking about customers and employees, which is a huge part of AI deployment in organizations, especially for the front line, you have, if you're high, you have a very clear governance plan already in place that exists, and you just launch that. So just thinking about from the beginning where you fit and how you create and customize your pilot plan to match. We have a couple other examples, and we're just picking the low and the high here to talk about today, but the playbook includes everything for how we would design a pilot. Mackenzie, you talked about data readiness and access to data. If you're low, we recommend, that you begin with synthetic or anonymized data, and it's in a sandbox, very, very controlled, using static FAQs or summaries, and it's manageable and it's tight and it's not going to have any chance at all of impacting anything else negatively. And then when you think about that very high or transformational organization, you go right to, we've got a full data audit. We've got cross-system map. We have all this in place. Congratulations to those organizations that do. Many have a lot of things, but it's hard to keep those kinds of things updated. But if you do, that's awesome. You just leverage those as you're planning the pilot. So those are just a couple of the steps that we wanted to point out, and how when we work together with our clients, we have different approaches. It's not a one size fits all. It's not an off the shelf, here you go, this is what we're doing. It's highly customized. It's highly important to know what does set you up for the most success. And even in a little billing inquiry pilot, you've got to think through how much your organization can handle and how to get that intent piloted and tested and learned, and then get to production from there.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes we get in the mindset that like getting to production is the end goal. But even as step 6 on your model demonstrates, you've got to evaluate, and there's work to be done in the continuation of things. And so I think that's a really important point of emphasis, that it's not just about sort of time to production and getting something live quickly. It's about whether it's proving value and dedicating time and space for that value evaluation.
Totally agree.
All right. So I think that's where we wrap up today. Crystal, unless there's anything else you wanted to share on this model.
No, I would love to keep the conversation going with our participants today and others. I know that we're going to pick up in a couple weeks to talk more about how to share best practices and some other work that PTP and ASAPP have done together. And I'm excited for that. And I, again, appreciate your knowledge and the expertise that ASAPP brings to this conversation and to the technology space and improving experiences from customers and employees' perspectives every single day.
It's been really fun to have this conversation with you today. And for folks, we are right at time. So I think we're going to move past questions for today, but just say thank you for joining us. Thank you to Crystal for being my partner in crime in this conversation. And we would love to continue the conversation and see you in December when we have our second edition of this series. So thank you so much and have a great day.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Happy Thanksgiving.
You too. Bye.
Bye.